everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm delighted today to be joined by Tom Goodyer and Boudewijn Niejens, and they'll introduce themselves and their role in the ISO 55000 series in a bit. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming along. We've got quite a lot of people registered for this event, so we will have people joining us as we carry on. And just wanted to talk a little bit about how we're going to do the session. So Tom and Boudewijn are going to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then maybe a bit longer, and then we'll do some questions. The questions we're going to be handling through Slido. So that's slido.com, and the code is 8041852, but I will put it into chat at regular points through the webinar. So please do put your questions in there. It just enables us to manage the questions a little bit easier from your point of view. You'll be able to see everybody else's questions, but also you'll be in a position whereby you'll be able to vote up questions. So we'll be able to get the most the questions of most interest answered first. So now I'm going to hand over to Tom and Boudewijn, and I wanted to say a massive thank you for them making the time to come and tell us all about the new and revised ISO 55000 series. So thank you both.
Okay, right. Well, welcome everyone. So we've got a very simple agenda. But we have lots of interesting information buried within that. Boudewijn and I will introduce ourselves. We're going to talk a bit about the standards, you know, what's happened, where we've come from, where we've gotten to, and where we're going next. We'll talk a bit more about the hot topics, which is the things that we want to focus on over the horizon, and then a call to arms as well, right? If you're dialing into this to because you're interested, then we probably would enjoy having you involved. And just as Ursula mentioned, if you've got questions, go to slido.com and just type in that number. So there you go, Boudewijn's just highlighting that for us there. So intros to us. So Tom Goodyer, the only bit of relevance to this conversation is that I am now the chair of ISO TC251. So that's the ISO technical committee that looks after all of this ISO stuff relating to asset management. But my day job is within WSP UK. Boudewijn.
Excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Boudewijn. I am the convener of Workgroup 3 within TC251, so I actually work under the orders of Tom. Workgroup 3 is in charge of communication, which means that we're essentially the people who don't develop standards, we just talk about them, which is actually very easy. I also do manage the mirror committee, TC251 mirror committee for Canada, so I actually have to read the standards at the very least. And I'm also on the board of the IM, and in my day-to-day life, I am the Chief Marketing Officer at Copperleaf in Vancouver. And so talking about ISO and the 55000 series, maybe first a little bit of context. So what is ISO and why does it matter? And so when you think of ISO, it's a bit of kind of the United Nations of standardization, if you wish. It's, as a slide says, it's a worldwide network of standardization bodies. So every country typically has a standardization body or multiple, but typically one. And ISO is effectively the umbrella organization that represents all these different standardization bodies. And by extension, therefore, it develops and publishes international standards which cover not one country, but all countries. The cool thing about that, of course, is that it does bring together experts from all over the world. So we have a very broad spectrum of expertise that we can draw upon to write these standards. And there's many of them. We have, well, within the ISO catalog, you'll find roughly 22,000 standards, which is kind of scary when you think of it. They're all driven on the fact that they're voluntary. So in other words, ISO does not write mandatory or legally mandatory standards. They are voluntary. You can decide if you want to adopt them. and they're developed based on consensus. So in other words, the idea is that it really is an international consensus that is being built, and on that we write a standard. Now, I said they're voluntary. The one caveat, of course, at some point in some jurisdictions, a government or another regulatory body might actually impose on you a standard, but that's not ISO's decision. That's the decision of a local authority to do so. What are these standards about? The bulk of them actually are for product compatibility. So they're technical standards where we're talking about, relatively smaller items. Like, for instance, a classic example, of course, is electrical plugs. How do you make sure that they are standardized? Well, they're not. There's 7 different ones of them around the world, but at least there are some zones in which they are standardized. The second category is product and services safety. So safety in general is actually something very important, and there's tons of standards around safety, of course, as you can imagine. And the third category, which is really the one that interests us, is management systems. So those are typically higher level standards in which we're trying to really kind of help organizations figure out how to organize themselves from a management point of view to actually run the show. And so all this work is done by about 800 different technical committees, all of them international committees, where best practices are shared, and we come up with this kind of famous consensus. And so Technical Committee 251 is the one that manages the 55,000 series, so all the work around asset management. And that committee has been growing quite a bit. When it was created in 2015, which is roughly when the standards were first released, we had 37 countries on board. And as you can see now, 9 years later, we have 55 countries, and you can see them on the map there. So clearly that shows that the standard, and kind of more broadly, asset management, is growing around the world. Interest is growing, and that's a good thing, of course, and we're very happy to see that. Now, up until last month or 2 months ago, what you could buy and read were 4 standards, and those I'm sure most of you know very well. It's 000, which outlines the principles of asset management. 01, which is really the requirements. So if you want to put a management system in place, this is what you have to follow. 02, which was kind of illustrating those requirements with application guidelines, and that one had been already reissued in 2018 to give it a bit more depth, if you wish. And then in 2019, we released a even more specific guide around the alignment of asset management, finance, and accounting, which I think is something that all of us will agree is important. There's always a strong link between asset management and finance, and it's not an easy link. So hence the need for guidance there. And with that, I'll pass it over to Tom to talk a bit about what's happening this year.
Okay, so the structure for how we do all this, right? All of these standards have to be updated or withdrawn, and so I think if any of you are familiar with those standards, the management system standards as they are, you'll be very, very familiar with that plan, do, check, act process, and that's exactly what applies to the development of standards themselves. So ISO has a very firm, predictable, repeatable process for developing these standards. And that's what we've got on the right-hand side there. So whether it's an entirely new standard or something like a standard, which ISO does too, or it's one that's coming up for its review cycle, you still start up there at the top with the dark blue. You have to propose a new work item, build some consensus as you work through, and it can take some slightly different tracks through here, but the point is we go through iterations of drafting and getting lots and lots of consensus from all of those countries that Boudewijn mentioned before, all of those countries who have opted into our particular technical committee. And once you get down to the point where you have a draft international standard, that goes out for much wider consumption. So a few of you will have seen those for the series that's come out this summer. And we've just reached the end of it. So just that big red box at the bottom there. So this summer we have published 6 new standards, which we'll talk more about in a second. Right, so the suite of standards as they are right now is this 7. Boudewijn mentioned the first 4 there, the top 4 rows. So we had versions 1 of those initial 3 came out in 2014. We updated the guidance document for a few particular reasons shortly afterwards, and then, as he said, 55010 came out a little bit after as well. Now, we were never supposed to be publishing 6 documents all at once in 2024, but largely direct and indirect effects of COVID have forced them all into the same cycle. And maybe there's some efficiencies for working like that, but it's also created a massive peak of activity for everyone involved in the TC, and it's been an incredible amount of work to get those revisions sorted for 00, 01, and 10, and then also develop these 3 new documents as well. But we did it. We got through. We probably all bear some scars for having done so, but but we reached it. 55002 in the logical flow of those initial 3, it's meant to be the one that follows, so we're all very happy and content with that. We decided about almost 4 years ago that we would concentrate on 00 and 01, get the requirements sorted, and then we'd have the same team who wrote those requirements move on to producing the guidance. And the benefit of that is we've agreed those requirements, and now the very same people who sat in the rooms debating about what we really intended when we created those very short, concise statements in 01, now have already started moving on to 02, where we can really provide some more detail about what was intended there. So that's the process. And then we've got the other 3 that came out as well. And we have more details in a second. Move on. There we go. Right. So what has changed this year? As you could interpret from that previous table, we have 6 new documents that came out. They all look very pretty, especially if you print them all out with the covers and yeah, and get them bound and have them on your desk, like many of us in the TC do. So we have our lovely tangible outputs, and yeah, we patted ourselves on the back. But we're moving on. I'll tell you, Boudewijn and I will take you through a little bit more detail about what each of those are now. So in the logical flow, the first one is 55,000. That's the one that is meant to provide information about the vocabulary, an overview of asset management, and what we mean by asset management from the TC, and those principles of asset management. That very word principles got a lot of attention through this process. And through many rounds of debate, we ended up trying to clarify what we meant of the principles of asset management versus the outcomes of asset management. And so we established that from the old list of principles in the original version, we've got these 3 principles, right? Things that we hold most dear when considering asset management and planning asset management. So value, alignment of what we're trying to do as an organization, and leadership. And then we've separated out outcomes, added in a couple of new outcomes as well. So those are about assurance, adaptability of an organization, and sustainability, of course. We also go into more detail there about the benefits of asset management, right? And the idea is this short document can help communicate to people when you're trying to push the very ideas of asset management. So there is more in there about the benefits. We took out some of the explanation of the elements of an asset management system because that is covered in other documents that we have. We speak a bit in there about the integration of management systems. There have been a lot of changes within ISO for all of the management system standards in the 10 years since we published. And so there are a lot more management system standards. There is a lot more commonality between them. So we wanted to address that. But it means there are opportunities, right, to integrate your management systems. We also start to talk about the maturity of asset management within organizations. And we also remove some of the annexes. Some of that information, for a whole host of reasons, has been rehomed in other parts of our portfolio now. So next, 55,001. So you've already had an hour-long explanation from Martin Kerr about exactly what changed and why and what it means. So we're just going to give you the one-slide recap here. As a reminder, the asset management system, this document is just about the requirements that we expect an organization to meet in asset management. And so just to run through some of those changes then, in section 4.5, we've got new requirements in there about asset management decision making and what value means. And the idea is that's meant to be better fit now for all sorts of different organizations. We talk more about the actions you need to undertake to address risk. Lots and lots of debate in risk. There are lots of other standards that talk about risk as well. We have our own we have our own requirements about risk, which should just meet nicely with the other standards about risk. Correspondingly, actions to address opportunities. So risks and opportunities are split out and treated slightly separately. Do I click on? The strategic asset management plan. We had plenty of feedback from the last 10 years about how organizations have found it, writing strategic asset management plans, how auditors have found it, reviewing them and certifying them. And so this is just updates here. We talk more in there about data and information. This was actually a fairly contentious section for reasons we'll come on to. But crucially, we now have a new standard that talks about that, and that pushes the envelope, and we're trying to make sure that this section is applicable to everyone. And then finally, 7.7 talks about knowledge and what organizations need to do with their knowledge internally about asset management. And then finally, the predictive action section. And this one, this was another slightly contentious section, but the idea is we're trying to talk about how you respond, to information you have and what that means for what you need to predict and how you change what you do as a result of those predictions.
Thanks for that. And yeah, as a reminder, Martin Kerr, who actually was the convener of the group that created this new version, did a webinar about 10 days ago, which you can find online at the IM if you want more detail. He spent a full hour explaining what Tom just did in 2 minutes. So you can imagine there's much more detail there. We're going to move on to another standard that was updated. So it was an existing standard that we just updated, and that's 55010. So again, as a reminder, that's about alignment of financial and non-financial functions in asset management, something which we're all really excited about. And therefore, this document is kind of aimed both at asset managers, but also at the financial community, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is to kind of build some mutual understanding on the both sides of the fence on how we can best work together. In the bigger scheme of things, this was a relatively minor update compared to 00 and 01 that Tom just mentioned. The update that we did on 010 was really mostly a matter of clarifications. Because it's an interesting topic and because it touches the finance community, which is outside of the space of asset management, clarifications were important. And therefore, it was largely a matter of coming up with better explanations around how we actually all align around organizational objectives. So how do we actually understand them on both sides of the fence, and how do we make sure that we're pulling in the same direction? And therefore also, how do we make sure that actually those objectives are achieved everywhere and that we don't kind of silo ourselves down into departmental objectives too much. And then finally, how we actually develop KPIs, indicators, especially non-financial indicators, and how those can contribute to actually achieve those objectives. As we all know, over the last few years, there's been a lot of debate around ESG and sustainability, and those are largely, going to contribute to non-financial KPIs. Of course, how do you actually tie those into the organization is an interesting challenge. So altogether, it's largely a matter here of just clarifying the original text. There's no big shift, I would say, philosophically, in what 55010 achieves. There are, though, the big shift comes with the next standard. That's a new one. It's one which has been in the work for a long, long time, because it was such a big shift that we ourselves had to scratch our head quite a few times to actually get it right. And that's the development application of public policy to enable asset management. So this standard, contrary to all the other ones that we have, is not so much about how you do asset management internally in your organization. It's more about how the outside world can actually push you or enable you to actually kind of get into asset management in earnest. And so the idea here is to really help or kind of give some ideas and guidance on how to develop public policies that would advance the adoption of asset management. So when you think of it, in many of our jurisdictions, government at any level, municipal, regional, provincial, national, governments can have a huge influence, of course, in organizations adopting asset management. And so the question then becomes, how do I actually make sure that these government bodies are actually interested in the topic and actually push in the right direction? So this is really what 5511 is all about. It's therefore, as I say, it's a bit of an outlier. What we're trying to do, therefore, is to describe what an enabling environment for asset management would be. So in other words, how do you make sure that everything lines up? Who are the stakeholders, the participants in that enabling environment, both from within government agencies or bodies and non-government participants, and how can they influence? And then what are their roles, therefore, in actually this enablement exercise? And to make it a bit more practical, there is a fair number of examples and actually interesting case studies that were added to 11 to really kind of show what has been happening around the world and might help you, therefore, in kind of this journey. So it is a bit of an outlier, as I said, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. So again, as I said, everything else that we've developed so far has been for individual organizations internally to work internally. 11 is, as it says here, guidance to help organizations influence other organizations to adopt asset management. So that'll be an experiment. We'll see how 11 does in the market, but it's definitely a much needed development, because clearly, government agencies in general can have a huge influence on the adoption or not of the standard within their jurisdictions. And then we have two other new standards where I'm going to hand it over back to Tom.
Thanks. Yep, so 55,012, it's another one of the brand new standards. So it's the second brand new one in the list. So this one is a guidance document on people involvement and competence in asset management. And I'm sure you've all heard it many times through your careers that for all we talk about our assets and our physical assets, our people assets are the most valuable one to us, right? Almost critical, perhaps. And this is a standard that is meant to help address that. So at least in my daily life, this is something that comes up a lot. The standard itself really doesn't talk. Sorry, when I say the standard, I'm almost always referring to 01. 55,001 doesn't talk very much about people and how you need to manage people and competence and communications. And that's what this one is supposed to be specifically about. And of course, people are at the heart of an asset management system and how it works, and it actually being embedded and working in real life. And this is guidance from the community about exactly what that could mean. And so it talks a lot about how you communicate, how you work with people to get everything embedded, right? So the entirety of your asset management system, from your policy right down to standard operating procedures. And so that gets into commitments to continual improvement, which we've got in there, but also what that means for leadership and what the expectations of leadership could be to help create and maintain a functioning asset management system. But of course, even for departments like HR and how you guys as asset managers or people working with asset management systems, what that means for your integration with other parts of the organization. Next. Okay, 55,013. This is the third of the brand new standards. So guidance on the management of data assets. Apologies if it's a slightly curious title, but we went back and forth a lot about that. And this is what we came back to as a global community. And so I mentioned in the single slide about 55,000, some changes about the data and information requirements. In 55,001, we are talking about only what is required, what do we think should be required for compliance with ISO 55001. This document provides more detail on what that could be, and also guidance about how to go further. You know, what does good look like? What can it really mean? And again, this is one that comes up a lot in my daily life, so and in my career up to this point. So it's one that's close to my heart. There is a lot out there, and this talks a lot more about, you know, what data quality could mean, how governance can work when you're working with asset data or data assets, and how that integrates into broader definitions of asset management systems, and how that all contributes back to, you know, the meeting objectives, right, and just having a well-functioning asset management system.
And as a reminder again, Shiv Iyer, who was the convener of this particular group, or co-convener, I should say, of this particular group, will be running a webinar on September 20th for the IM. So again, if you want more detail on this particular standard, then dial back in on September 20th, and Shiv will explain to you in minute detail what's in this particular standard, which I do think is going to be quite important. So as a quick little recap, what you're really seeing is that, as from day one, there's three different components that we're trying to build in the 55,000 series, right? There is the why you would do asset management and why you would adopt a management system. There is what you need to do, which is 5501, of course, and then there is the how. And as you could expect, 55,000 is the why, relatively simple document. 5501, which we all love and read every morning, is of course the what, because that's the requirements. And then the how is growing, because there's many ways, of course, of skinning the cat, and there's also many different aspects that we're trying to cover, as we just described in the last 10 minutes. So 02 is the generalist approach, a bit of everything, kind of go clause by clause, basically describing how to interpret every clause. And then there is 10, 12, and 13 that we just described, which dig a bit deeper into particular areas. All this is effectively internal to an organization. So you're really kind of applying this within your organization. And as we just described too, now we're going to look a bit externally, and there 11 covers two aspects, both why asset management systems are important, and therefore why should we advocate or enable organizations to go in that direction. And then it also shows you how you might want to pull that off. So in other words, if you're going to try to influence organizations and building an enabling environment, how would you do that? So this is a slightly more ambitious approach, but I think it has its merit. And then importantly too, because the question comes up all the time, is, all right, well, when I say that I'm certified to ISO 55000, what does it mean? What it really means is that you certify to 5501. That's the only certifiable standard in the whole series. because it is the one that contains all the actual formal requirements. So when we talk about certification, that's the only one that you can certify to. Everything else is effectively there to create a explanation and further detailed environment around these requirements, which are held in 5501. And actually, Tom, that reminds me, one thing which we didn't mention in our slide on 5501, and we might want to do, is that what is the amount of requirements? It has grown. Do you remember the exact number of requirements now compared to the
Or
old ones?
I will find the slide before we get to Q&A. I have it somewhere.
Yeah, off the top of my head, it's about 30% more, but it's somewhere in that order of magnitude, if I remember.
Yeah, I
Um,
think it's 20 to 30% more, something like that. One of the earlier versions had 49% more, and unsurprisingly, that was cut back down.
yes, correct. Very good. Well, with that in mind, so that's where we stand today. But of course, Tom, who is the new chair, has a full agenda of ideas. So he's going to talk a bit about what's coming next right now.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so just to close out, we're going to talk a little bit about the future. So the publication of those documents closes out by far the busiest chapter of work we have had in the entire history of this technical committee. And it feels wonderful to have it out, and we're all enjoying a little bit of a breather. But we have commitments to keep going. Right? We've got a few things in the pipeline already, which I'll mention in a second. But most importantly, we hold ourselves to the same philosophies that we espouse in the standards, right? Which is we should only be doing work if that work is in agreement with the most strategic of our interests, right? And so we have a business plan process led by Ashley Barrett, and over the last few years, our main three priorities that we've agreed globally are working on sustainability in asset management, working on digitalization in asset management, and working on intangibles in asset management. Right? And so intangibles really is just assets that are not simply defined tangible assets. And slightly separate to those key priorities, there's a common theme there around decision making. And so that these are the key planks of how we decide what our future work is going to be. I'm going to click on. So on that point about decision making, we're already a couple of steps through that flowchart that I showed earlier into creating what will be ISO 55014 on asset management. And that one is being led by Claire Gowson from here in the UK. And it's a really broad ask, right? Trying to create a new guidance document on decision making and asset management. But the things that we're addressing in that document, as it stands at the moment, are things like value frameworks, how we work with stakeholders to include them in decision making, how we come up with optimal decisions, and how we map the outcomes of our decision making. And then we have another big stream of work going on at the moment. It doesn't have a number as such yet, but it's actually two things happening in parallel. And that is directly addressing those questions or that theme of ours about sustainability and asset management. I won't go into the detail too much in half a slide, but the intention is in the very short term, we create a new PAS document. And then in due course, we will convene something called an IWA, which is potentially a quick route to creating a quicker route to creating an ISO standard with a lot of involvement for the stakeholders other than just our existing technical committee. In that, we will address things like sustainability, climate change and asset management, resilience, what we think natural assets are and how we address those with an asset management system, and therefore, of course, what even is sustainable asset management. Anyway, that's the intention with that work. That's only getting moving right
And just to clarify, for those of you who are not ISO aficionados who don't know all the acronyms,
Yeah.
a PAS is a publicly available specification. So it's essentially a lighter standard, if you wish, which doesn't go through as much scrutiny as the other ones. And IWA is an actual international workshop agreement, which is even lighter. That is literally bringing stakeholders around a table, a physical table or a virtual table, but literally it's a couple of meetings during which we agree on grand statements or big principles, and we publish those. So that's even lighter. But both of them are useful in the sense that they're quick, and therefore it allows us to really kind of get this discussion going very rapidly before we then formalize it maybe into a true standard later on.
Yeah, it's worth saying as well, for those of you with very long memories, ISO 55001 really started off as PAS 55. And the PASs as they used to be at that time were structured slightly differently, but again, creating a PAS is a slightly easier and quicker way to create something like a standard that you can then evolve into a standard if it goes well, in industry, if it's well received. And another reason Boudewijn is very close to the detail on this one is that this initiative is very much being led by his countrymen out of Canada.
True. For whatever reason, the Canadians are passionate about this. So we'll save the planet. Good. So with that being said, there's a lot of information that we went through today. There's much more available on the website of TC251. So within the ISO organization, every website, every committee, if they choose so, can create their own website. We definitely did because we feel we have a lot to say. And so here's the address, and the content is being updated quite regularly, and especially right now, of course, because we've produced a lot of stuff lately. So you'll find a lot of detail there, both about the standards, also about complementary documents which are not standards, not even passes, not even IWAs, are just really kind of articles that we produce within TC251 on a regular basis to kind of dig deeper or to explain in more detail a particular aspect of a standard or of what we have published elsewhere. Those publications are free. So if you go to the publication tab within this website, you'll find dozens of free publications which complement all the other work that has been published formally by ISO, and for that you have to pay, of course. So there's that. There is also links to reputable organizations that have information that might complement what we at ISO are producing. So that could be useful. And then there is a very famous list, which is what we call the known certified organizations list, which shows you the organizations that we know to be certified. Now, it's a voluntary process. So in other words, if you're certified as an organization, you can submit your certificates to us, and we'll add you to the list. The usefulness of the list, of course, comes from the fact that it allows you to see which of your peers, either in your country or in your sector, might be certified, and that might kind of inspire you to either connect with them or to kind of join the club. So in other words, it's just a useful reference to see what's going on with the standard. It's by no means complete because, of course, we only know what we know, what people tell us, but it is definitely useful. So that's the website. I encourage you to go and visit it. And most of the time, it's available in 9 different languages. You can see the little flags on the far left there where you can click on. Right now, that has been disabled just because we've changed everything in the last few weeks because of all the new standards. So it takes a bit of time for our friends around the world to send us their translated versions that we'll make public again in a couple of weeks. From the beginning, we said that this is a collaborative effort, and it's experts from all around the world that literally convene and write these standards. And this is literally the way it looks. This was, I think, in Australia a few years back, if I remember. This was pre-COVID, as you can see by the density of the room. But it literally is a matter for us once a year, typically, to all come together somewhere in the world and to debate and produce at least the skeleton of the standards. And then for the rest of the year, the meetings are virtual and are held on quite high frequency in many organizations, or many of the working groups. It's literally a bi-weekly exercise, so there's a lot going on. But of course, the in-person meetings once a year are really kind of the cherry on the cake. And therefore, locations are carefully chosen, of course, to make sure that everybody shows up. These are just a few postcards of the places that we've been over the years. I think that's actually the main reason Tom joined and became the chair, is he actually wants to actually go and enjoy all these beautiful places around the world. So this is just to say that yes, it's hard work, but we do try to kind of have a lighter side to it too, and we do try to enjoy ourselves as we travel the world and write standards. Because at the end of the day, these are your standards, and with that, because they're increasingly important in our daily lives, we really need you to help us in kind of contributing your knowledge to this international effort. It is a great exercise. I've been part of this since day one, since the TC was created. You obviously learn a lot by sharing best practices, by hearing from others what they're doing, and trying to kind of make sense out of it and turning it into a best practice document for everybody. Through that, you're shaping the future of asset management, of course, which I think is important for all of us. And you build a phenomenal network. I cannot tell you how many times I've used the connections that I've made through ISO in my daily life, because essentially you know all the experts around the world now. So it's as simple as that. And so if you're interested in joining us in this noble effort, that happens typically through your national standards body. So in other words, whatever country you are, there will be a national standards body. You can find the list at the link at the very bottom there. Through them, you can kind of sign up to become an expert in your country, and then your country will then delegate you to become part of the international effort, if you wish. So that was our story today. I'd like to thank you for listening. What I've put here in the slide is both our email addresses if you want to connect with us, and also, again, the Slido link if you want to ask questions. And now I'll go back to Ursula, who I'm sure has a few questions for us.
You'll be glad to know there are lots of questions. Miranda, if you will assume presenter mode and just put the questions up so everyone can see them. I'll kick off whilst Miranda's doing that. So the first question is, I think you've really answered this question just now, but what is the requirement to become an ISO TC 251 member? So I think it feels like you've answered that question.
It's probably worth saying, though, that there are different requirements in each country, right? And so we centrally have no control over that whatsoever. Standards Canada or BSI, they make their own rules about who gets accepted onto those committees, and then those committee chairs and committee managers make decisions about who they want to send along to work in the working groups that we've discussed for drafting and so on.
And I'd like to add that even if you're not part of the big international circus that was just on screen there, a lot of the members, certainly in Canada, we have maybe, I'm going to say 70–80% of the members do not travel. They just contribute in particular working groups within the context of a working group representing Canada as an expert in that effort. So there's two layers to it, really. There's local experts who just contribute to a particular working group to a particular standard, and then there is the ones that are lucky or unlucky enough, depending on how you look at it, to go and spend a week in Rio de Janeiro to argue about this in more detail, and then kind of bring it to a good end.
The second point is, I should have said at the beginning, I'm sure that Boudewijn and Tom will be very happy to share the slides. And what I'll do is we'll make sure we put those slides with the recording. That's what we did with Martin's. We'll put a PDF of those slides. So if you're okay with that.
Of course.
Then the next question, we've answered the question about what's the requirement. So we don't need that one. The one that we've lost because it's jumped around. But anyway, I'll go. Why does ISO 00 does not provide clarity and address senior executive leadership directly? It's that question I think we should tackle next.
Yeah, and why does it not make a business case for their support in asset management?
Yeah.
I think it was definitely an ask of the revised standard. It was more a product of consensus building, between the countries that they wanted, or the consensus was we wanted a cleaner document that didn't quite go so far as to directly make a business case addressed at executive leadership. That's all it was. It's a simpler document that is meant to provide the overview and the principles of asset management. That's the purpose of the document that we ended up with.
Okay, and then the next one, I think you've broadly answered, but what other areas are looking at to develop guidance or standards beyond O2? So, I think this was probably asked during the session when you were talking about O2, but you hadn't got to the exciting new stuff you're doing. So
yeah. That's fine, but it's a trigger to maybe just make one additional point though. So I spoke about what those key strategic themes of ours are. But we have a constant flow of brilliant, intelligent people from all over the world who know the industries in their countries, or even more than just their countries, and are fizzing with ideas of what we could do, right? What the industry could find valuable for us to work on. And so there is a role for us in the management team to basically review those, filter them down, consolidate different ideas into things together. And so I spoke about those broad themes, but anyone who has ideas is really welcome to push them. If you're not on your local committee, to push them towards committee members in your country, and see where the process takes us. But there is absolutely a process there for us to come up with new things to focus on, to try and create a new documentation that will be of value.
And just to complement on that, because you mentioned the word process, ISO being ISO, there's of course also a process to validate those ideas. So yes, the management team can look at them, but after that, it's down to the numbers again. And in this particular context, there is a minimum amount of countries that have to commit to support the development of a new standard. So in other words, if we say, yeah, that looks like a great idea, that actually goes out for vote, access for a better word. And the idea is, I think it's 5 countries, if I remember well, 5 countries have to commit to actually send experts to actually start working on this, so that we do have a broad consensus. If it were a one country idea and only a one country development, of course, that would not be very representative of an international consensus. So I think 5 is a number, if I remember well, at the minimum.
And it's the same. Yeah, and it's the same for quorum as well. At every meeting, you have to have 5 different countries represented. So even if people are all in agreement early on, if you only get, I don't know, the Brits and the Canadians showing up to meetings, nothing can progress, and it will end up being kicked off of the process.
So the next question is from our good friend Joe about 31,000. So does internalising risk into the standard lessen the dependency on 31,000?
I mean, that is a really brilliant question, and it is definitely one that has been debated a lot within the technical committee. To complicate matters, almost all of the management system standards have their own views on risk, and the views on risk and opportunity is included in those standards. And so over the last few years, there has been a whole process of ISO trying to decide how much are they going to let all of us write our own requirements about risk and what it means for our particular management system. And what we have in there is simply the outcome of that process. I think we have some stakeholders who wanted to go ahead and almost write an entire 31,001 document within the 55,000 series. and we've got some others who think, well, it should just be basically cross-referenced out. I think what we have is something in between.
The next question, because I've answered the O2, you've addressed the O2 question, is considering that there are companies certified by the previous edition of O1, is there a transition plan for the new version? And I think there's another question later on, which is what's the period? You know, if somebody's been doing in the process of doing certification now, like sort of gap analysis or surveillance or whatever, what's the transition period? And it came up on Martin's webinar as well, as you might expect. So it'd be good to get your views on that.
Yeah. So this is the same matter for all of the requirements standards documents that ISO produces, right? You know, if it's getting updated and it's different, how do we manage the transition? So that is entirely led by the community of audit firms. RTC doesn't get to be involved with that at all unless they invite us to some meetings to be involved. But the broad process is we, as TC251, we have produced the new ISO 55001 that is out there in the world. The auditors, it is now over to them. They have to recognize that we have published a new one. They have to put together their own plan for how are they going to check the governance of their audit practices to make sure that they are well set up for carrying out audits against the new standard. I guess they will have to go out and figure out, are our own auditors competent to do this still, that kind of thing. In general, it works like this, that you have a 3-year transition period. So assuming all of that stuff happens in the background with the audit community without, it just happens as it's supposed to. In about 3 years' time, they will switch over and they will probably only offer to audit companies against the new standard. What we are seeing already is that some of them are already saying they're willing to run an audit today, if you can track them in, against the new standard or the old standard. And that's probably how it will run for everyone seeking to certify themselves over the next 3 years. You'll probably be given a choice. If you've been certified within the last year or so, and you've got a couple of years of surveillance audits, and you were certified to the 2014 edition, your surveillance audits will certainly be against the 2014 edition. You won't change the standard to which you're held midway through one of those cycles, or at least I've never heard of that happening. Maybe it's possible.
Thank you. And it is the case, isn't it, Tom Boudewijn, that the 14 version hasn't been withdrawn per se?
No, as far as I understand it, it's still available on the site.
Yeah.
Right. You'll have to dig a bit though. I mean, if you type in 01 now, you're automatically directed to the 24 version, which makes sense.
Yeah. Then we've got a question from Susie Heap about asking suggestions on how to use the new standard effectively to gain buy-in, sell to asset owners effectively.
Yep. Boudewijn, that's one for you, right?
We're talking of 11 in particular, or do we see this broadly?
I think for all of them. I understood Susie's question to be, we've published a load of new documents. How can we maximize, what we've done to help push asset management?
Well, I think part of the answer comes from the fact that we have more hows, in the sense that, of course, as you write requirements, those are effectively constraining you to some extent in how you do asset management, and therefore automatically the question becomes, okay, well, how do I do this? So the fact that we now have effectively 4 documents describing how different aspects of an asset management system might look, that of course should make it easier and also more interesting to actually adopt the standard, because now you really have good guidance on a number of different routes basically, or different aspects of the discipline. That's one. As I said, 11 is going to be an interesting experiment, because there we're really proactively now trying to get to the point where outside pressure will be applied on you, or on organizations in general, to actually adopt asset management. And when you think of the amount of funding that actually flows through from any type of government agency down through the funnel to asset owners, if that funding is now dependent on good asset management, then that, of course, could be a very powerful tool to push for the adoption of asset management. And finally, I think the O1 itself, of course, had its limitations. Let's not forget that 2014 version was the first version, so it was a first best effort. We've taken into consideration a lot of the feedback that we've received over the last 10 years. So the new 55001 2024, oh my God, this is a mouthful, is actually definitely a better document, as Martin described 10 days ago. So I do think that it just has more appeal, or should have more appeal, to organizations as a whole.
The next question, and we can't see it here, I'm just waiting for it to come up, is about ESG. So those ESG requirements, I think it'd be good if you could just talk about those.
Well, that's a whole topic. We could spend a few hours on that. But at the level of asset management, if you think of it, it's back to a comment that I made earlier, that is historically, most organizations were measuring their performance purely on a financial basis, right? I mean, that's what you were reporting on at the end of the day. You were getting a financial report, and that showed how well the company did. There's clearly a movement underway, with a few bumps along the road, but nevertheless, there is a movement underway by which performance will be measured on a broader spectrum of KPIs, including non-financial metrics, some of them being ESG driven. As ESG is becoming, I would nearly say mandatory in many places, as the reporting side of it is becoming mandatory, you could argue that if I'm going to have to report as an organization on ESG metrics, I'm going to want to have those metrics look good. So in other words, very quickly, my reporting is going to turn into objectives. I'm going to have objectives to achieve specific ESG targets, because I want to look good. And that, of course, ties in very nicely to our broader concept of value, which is much expanded in both 00 and 01 in the new edition. That is the fact that we're there to create value. Well, value now has a broader definition, which includes non-financial metrics. So you can see this little loop that is starting to develop here, where on the one hand you have to report on it, on the other hand it'll become an objective, and to achieve those objectives you need a value framework which includes those objectives, and which will have to percolate through the whole decision-making chain in asset management. So that's the way it's going to pan out, and that's also one of the reasons why we're doing work in 55014 on decision-making, which is becoming increasingly complex, because you have more and more factors that you have to include in your decision-making.
Thank you. The next question, I think, is a question about the IAM SAM methodology. So I'm just going to answer very, very quickly, so that we don't, and it's also, we've got certification as well come up. We are doing work in the IAM to update to, we went through and prioritized all the areas that we knew we needed to look at, not just because of the ISO changes, but also because of the changes in the global forum landscape. We do have a prioritized list. I'm happy to pick up with anyone who particularly wants to get involved in that, but I want to give the floor to Tom and Boudewijn to talk mainly about the ISO changes. So we are doing work on all of the things that you've highlighted that are IAM resources. So I think we've really got a chance for one last question. There's a very specific question there about predictive actions, which I think is an 01 question that Martin raised. Martin covered some stuff around the predictive actions being a relatively new area. Do you really want to pick up, I don't know whether you really want to get into that detail, or maybe pick up another question around.
Happy to. There's almost no answer really, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the document is out, and it's the product of a lot of back and forth, and there will be multiple places where you can do exactly the same exercise, right? And say, well, if I'm doing that, this particular requirement would probably seem a bit redundant. And yes, it will be. But we still, as a TC and with the stakeholders we work with, felt that it was still worth calling out those particular sentences. Nothing is left in there accidentally. It has had thousands and thousands of eyes cast over it and thousands of hours of debate for every sentence that you can see. So yes, some of it will be redundant. Some of it may be redundant because it agrees too well with each other. Some of it may be weird because it disagrees with one another. But I don't want to say all that's deliberate, but that is where we got to. Going through this.
Yeah, maybe just to add a little bit to that, we did shift from preventive to predictive. And the idea was really to make it more broad, because the original text in the previous version was very much about preventing disaster, to put it simply. This one is much more about predictive in general. So you can be on the positive and on the negative side.
Thank you. I think we're going to stop there because we're right at the top of the hour for everyone, and we do try and have an hour cut off. So I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's come along to join in the session, and for all your questions. There are many more questions. We will make sure we get those questions across to Boudewijn and Tom so they can have a look at all the questions that everyone asked, and we might be able to find a way to see about answering some of them in another format. I wanted to say a massive thank you to Tom and Boudewijn for joining us. And if anyone you wanted to pick up on, I did put the link to the Martin Kerr webinar recording in the chat as well. So, and this will be made available, the recording and the slides, on the IAM website, and we will also post a link to it on LinkedIn. So thank you everyone for joining.